Today we're going to talk a little bit about cutting fabrics, and I'm going to go from kind of the least number of tools to the most number of tools. And all these methods work. It's just a question sometimes of what you have available and also your preference. But we'll just start with a few terms. This is a woven fabric, and part of how you can tell is it's not super stretchy. If you look really closely, you can also see this is what's called the selvage edge. In this case, this edge is printed with some text, which is kind of a dead giveaway, but also usually the text or the print for the fabric doesn't come all the way to the edge, and there's this little edge here, and it looks a little bit different. It's clearly not a cut edge or a torn edge. It's very, very firm and very stable. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to see what happens if we snip through a little bit of that selvage edge and tear across the fabric. Now, why would we do this? We do this so that we can be sure what we're looking at is a straight across the fabric seam matching when it was woven. Not every print is printed completely straight on the fabric, but we want to make sure that our cuts are straight. So we're going to start with a really quick tear. You always want to tear kind of as fast as possible to help keep it from going off course. And one thing you might notice, the edge now looks a little wobbly. You can press that out if it bothers you a lot. In this case, we're going to leave it alone. But for our first bit across the fabric, we can say, okay, now we know we can fold selvage edge to selvage edge and kind of match our wobbly top to itself. So now we can be pretty confident that this is actually a square piece of fabric as long as the selvage edges match as you go down. So we can kind of line that up. I'm not going to go all the way down, but just to give you an idea. And then smooth it out gently on your table. Just make sure everything's laying nice and flat. And then that gives me an opportunity to also double check the width of my fabric. In this case I have a grid, but you can use a ruler or a tape measure. And I'm at about 21.5 here. So then twice that would be 43 inches, which is a little narrow. Often quilting fabrics are 44 inches, but with shrinking in the wash, it's not that unusual for it to be a little narrow. For the straps of our bag, I believe we want this to be 4 inches. Let me just double check. Yep. We want 4 inches basically from the top of the fabric by whatever the width of the fabric is. And so I'm just going to tear that again. I'm going to measure, and again you can use either a ruler or a tape measure for this. I'm going to measure 4 inches down. There's my mark. Put one little snip with my scissors, and then tear that. Well, maybe I decide I'm happy with tearing for the strap, but I would like it if I didn't have to press out wobbly edges for my actual bag. I'm going to put that aside. I'm going to reline up my piece here. Now I fold in half pretty much as often as I can because it saves me cutting. Then I only have to cut halfway across and not all the way across. So once again, I'm just lining up the top edge, which I know is a nice square line. And then I'm lining up the selvage edges with each other, making sure it's nice and flat. Okay. So for the lining and the outside of the bag, we want 4 15-inch square pieces. So that would start by basically we want to lop off a 15-inch length of this fabric. A couple different ways to do it, but the first way I'm going to show you is just using my scissors. So I've got my tape measure again. You could also use a ruler for this. I'm going to measure 15 inches down, then I'm going to mark it with a little chalk. This is a white chalk, so you won't be able to see it. You could also mark it with tape or really anything that you're confident will come off the fabric after you're done. I'm confident about this chalk, so I'm going to use that. You can, if in a real pinch, you can take a bar of soap and kind of sharpen it with a knife and use that. I'm just going to give myself some kind of a roadmap to cut across here. And again, I realize you probably can't see this on camera, and I can kind of barely see it, but that's kind of the point. That way I'm not stuck with it later. Okay, I can see my little marks, so I'm going to connect the dots here all the way across. Yep. So there's my 15 inches down from the top. And you can see here I have more than one scissors. These are the ones I actually probably use the most often in the workroom. These are my extra big monster ones that I use for special occasions. And these are kind of my travel ones that I use for when I'm going to a class, because the gold handles make them easy for me to remember to take home. These are the scissors I use to cut paper. So I only use these for paper, and I don't use any of these other ones for paper, ever. Paper dulls scissors very quickly. You don't want to do that. One thing you might notice, these have kind of what's called offset position, which means that you can cut keeping the blade really close to the table, but then your hand is still in a pretty natural position. You're not having to bend way down low. Like, these aren't as offset, so it would be a little harder to cut if I did use them for fabric, which I don't. So I'm just going to cut, and the standard is if you're right-handed, you put the part you're trying to keep to the side, to the left side of your blades. In most situations, it doesn't really matter that much, and I'm just going to do it here because it's easier because of where the table is. I hope you can see that. You want to take long cuts, just as long as you can make them. Alright, so that's my first cut. And since I know I want square pieces for my piece, the first thing I'm going to do is open up. I'm going to actually just cut off the selvage edge. Sometimes it behaves differently than the rest of the fabric, and I just don't want to have to deal with it, so I'm just going to cut it off. Now, how do I get a square? Well, obviously I can measure again, or I can cheat a little bit by just folding like that. And then I can use this edge as my guide for my next cut. I can also take an opportunity to trim off any of these little messy bits that are sticking out that bother me. So just cut one. Now, another tool I really love to use while cutting involves this mat. This is called a self-healing mat, and it's called that because you can use a blade right on it and it won't harm the mat. It also prevents the table from harming the blade. If you just cut on a regular table, your blade will dull very, very quickly. So for this, I like to use a nice long ruler, and I'm going to count over my 15 spots by 15 inches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. And since my ruler is longer than my piece is wide, it's very easy for me to see where I want that to go. Take my rotary cutter, and just like the shears, I have my paper rotary cutter and my fabric rotary cutter. And always make sure to keep your fingers away from the blade. These are very sharp and you could really hurt yourself. A little faster than the shears. Sometimes easier to make it more accurate too. Now you might notice because my fabric was a little narrow, I'm not going to be able to get 3 panels out of one piece, so I'm going to make a second 15-inch cut on my main fabric. I think I said, so we've done cutting with scissors, we've done cutting with rotary, we've done tearing. The last way is really actually more about the measurement part than anything else. Again, I'm going to fold in half. Fold in half. Watch those edges. And smooth. Well, maybe I don't feel like actually measuring more than once. I could measure on a piece of paper, which if you have big paper, which most of you will because you've been receiving shipments from companies like Amazon, oftentimes there is brown paper in those shipments. You can just press this out on your ironing board to make it flatter, and then measure it however you want, and then you've got your paper pattern. And I can hold that there, and then for this, you can either pin it in place, or you can use pattern weights, like that. And then now you're ready to cut, and I put myself in kind of a bad spot. So ideally I would be just to the right of my piece, or to the left of my piece. I kind of put the table in the way, but I think I'll manage. Again, if I'm going to use the blade, I want some sort of guide to keep me from cutting myself, or reduce the chance of cutting myself. But then this same method works perfectly fine with shears too. I'll open it up and show you how that next cut would work. It's okay, here's my piece. You can see that my first cut there wasn't perfect, but it's pretty good. Probably close enough. I can trim that up if I want to. Where are my pens? I never have everything I want where I want it. So in this case, I'm going to hold the paper and the fabric together using pins. And you don't need a million pens, depending on how complicated your shape is. You can see this is... oh, one thing I didn't do is you can... yeah. In this case, I'm kind of letting this fall a little bit, not square. That's me just being a little lazy. But ideally, I'll do it the right way. What you want to do is you can either line this up directly with the selvage edge, and yes, I can see that it's kind of going off a little bit, but I'm just going to live with that. Or you can offset it a little bit, but then you want to make sure that this edge is always the same distance from this edge. So for that, a good use for that is a ruler. Line up my ruler edge here. Line up my paper pattern. And in my opinion, like, this is a little bit wrong here. You can see that it's going off that edge. But I'd rather have that than have the whole thing be crooked, just to satisfy my ego. Now, if I were being really careful, I could have cut this at 16 inches, so then I would be really sure that even if it was a little crooked, I would still be able to use the piece. I'm still going to use the piece, but you know what I mean. Okay, now that I've taped that on, I can grab the really serious shears and show you. They're not really that different, they're just a little bigger. You can see that it has to lift a little bit just to get the blade under there, but the goal is to keep it as close to the table as possible. I'm going to make the cut from each side, but you can see what's happening is this is going to start getting my way, and I can just kind of lift it, very gently lift it out of the way. There's that.